So 20 minutes, you'd say, and time for questions?
Yeah. Great. Well, let's make a start. Welcome to those of you who are visiting the Blavatnik School of Government for the first time. I'm Ngaire Woods here at the school. And today we're very privileged to have Professor David Ellwood with us. David has spent this term at the school helping us in every way to think about how we could improve what we're doing. And he does this with the extraordinary experience of 11 years leading the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. A job he not only did incredibly well, but unusually at the end of his term, he was loved by everybody. And that's quite rare in that kind of job.
You can tell I did absolutely nothing and asked for nothing. That's right.
But, you know, he came to that deanship with an experience both as one of America's top researchers on poverty and social mobility, but also having spent time in government as Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation in the US Department of Health and Human Services. He worked as co-chair of President Clinton's working group on welfare reforms, family support, and independence. And he's now involved in a big post-dean project on poverty and social mobility in the United States, about which I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit this evening. David, it's just such a pleasure to get to listen to you on this topic, but I can't miss this opportunity just to say from all of us at the Blavatnik School how much we've appreciated your patience and wisdom and generosity in just giving us this magnificent gift of your time this term to help us be a little better. Thank you.
Thank you, Ngaire. And let me just say the gift was for me. I'd stepped down after 11 years, and it was Ngaire suggested I come visit. She suggested the winter term, as I recall, and I suggested this term instead. I think I made the right choice. My wife, who's over here, Marilyn, has been joining me this entire time. So it's been an incredibly exciting experience, and indeed part of my reason for coming was I wanted to see what one of these things looked like at the beginning. And it's really quite exciting and quite amazing to see what's all going on and so forth. And I would just wanted to say, besides a tremendous word of thanks and my admiration for Ngaire, the best test of whether you really admire someone or not is whether you put them on your board. So we have a visiting committee, and Ngaire's on the visiting committee now. Unfortunately, my successor inherits her, so we'll see what happens. But it should be great. But I just wanted to also say how important I believe this school is, as well as schools more broadly. You know, it is really easy to get discouraged with the world. Most people find something to complain about bitterly, particularly in this time of politics and poverty and Brexit and you name it. There's just so much wrong out there and so many things that feel just outrageous. And there are very, very, very few institutions who thinks it's their job to fix it all. But you do. Those of you involved in the school in whatever way, whether you're a student or a faculty member or staff or any other supporter in any other way, it's really, really important that there be people who believe you can make the world a better place, and it's their responsibility to do it. It is an enormously naive notion, and I hope your naivete catches on, because it is something that when you look back, I think you will see in 10 years and 20 years and 30 years the extraordinary impact that this institution's had, not only through its, heavily through its students, but also through its ideas. And it's therefore an honor. So thank you, Ngaire, for all the work you put into it, but everyone else as well. So which brings me actually to one of those kinds of questions that everybody complains about, but it's really hard to do something about, which is broadly thought of as poverty. And we know inequality is growing across the world in ways that are frightening. Poverty is declining, and as many countries grow, although it's often accompanied by a growing inequality at the same moment. And so the real question is, what should we do about that? How do we think about it? How do you move people into something that's not poverty? And so I actually want to be, I'm in the middle of this. I actually don't have a lot of answers. So that's a real, so not only am I talking about a really unpleasant topic, I'm not even going to give you very good answers. On the other hand, Joe and I came and talked yesterday. He was really a downer also. I mean, he was really down on Trump and worried about lots of things. So I'm just I am very much, I would say, in the tradition of ex-deans at the Kennedy School. But I want to start actually by asking you the first question. And I'd actually like to hear a few answers. And that is, I ask what you do is right this minute, in your own mind, picture someone, a typical example, whatever, of someone, let's call them working age, adult or family, that is kind of mired in poverty. Okay? You just kind of think they're not going very far, very fast. They're in real trouble. They're stuck. Okay, and I really want each of you to kind of come up with an image in your own head of someone like that. And then I want a few of you to be brave enough to give me kind of your image. And I'd like to start actually with people from the developed world, if you have such examples, but also talk to people in the others. I just want to hear how you think about it, because I don't know. I don't know how people think about it here. So, what's an example? Give me an example of someone, something. What do they look like? What's their issue, and so on. And we have a microphone here. On the other hand, we have really, really frightened people.
Okay, so David, my example is actually a couple I knew in my childhood. We'll call them Mr. and Mrs. McDonald for sake of argument. He's a former miner. Has been health retired out of working life through very serious emphysema, and is pretty ill, and his wife is essentially his carer. She gets by on a very modest income from some cleaning for other people, and he has a UK state disability pension, which doesn't add up to a whole lot, and they live in a relatively small damp flat, and get by with remarkable dignity, without a great deal of financial freedom to interact with their family or even see their family who live quite a long way away, and keep themselves largely to themselves because they are slightly embarrassed by the situation which they find themselves in, having previously been proud wage-earning folk.
It's a great example. And what would they most want?
Enough disposable income to buy the kind of gifts for their grandchildren they would want to buy.
Okay, other examples. And I'm not looking only for people you know of or whatever. They're also, what's your image? What do you think people's images are? Yes, go ahead. Could you mind identifying yourselves?
Sorry, Helen Barnard. I work here at BSG. I can think of a couple. I don't know them personally, but I observe them from time to time. They look as if they've had healthy, childhoods from their physical experience, appearance, but they live under a tarpaulin. They have no facilities, running water, latrine facilities. I can hear them arguing a lot from time to time. I suspect alcohol is used as a way of helping them to pass the hours. And what would they like most? I imagine a permanent place to live.
Great. Others?
Hello, I'm with the Foreign Service Program. I'm Polish, which is kind of the emerging development. My example would be from the verge between poverty and not even middle class, but that's a huge class in Poland. And I would think of a young person, say late 20s, earning enough money for subsistence, but not enough to save anything to increase the the skills qualification, not enough to even get a mortgage loan. And like the worst thing in this person's kind of perspective is that there is no prospect of earning more in the future, even if they have, say, good vocational education.
And what would they most like?
Second?
What would they most prefer? What would their dream? What would his dream be?
My understanding is that prospects of getting out of it with their hard work.
Yep. Okay. Now let's open up anybody, any country, any other thing, just one or two more of these just to get a sense.
Hello, my name is Alice Wang. I'm one of the MPP students here from New Zealand, but my example is from a family that I know, sort of extended family in China. So I guess you have a couple who are in their late 50s, living in quite a rural region of northern China, both in fairly unskilled labor. I think both the wife and the husband work in a kind of manufacturing plant, earning, I don't know what, but it would be very low compared to what wages we're used to here. And their main concern is that they have a daughter who is in her probably mid to late 20s, but she has a significant learning disability, and so she isn't actually able to work. And so a significant portion of their wages not only goes to maintaining some kind of roof over their head and food on the table, but also supporting this daughter of theirs who cannot support herself. And I guess their concern and possibly, they are in poverty now, but I think what really weighs on their mind is their futures. So what happens when either the wife or the husband has some illness, isn't able to work? What happens when they become old, unable to support themselves and unable to support their daughter? And I think possibly what they're looking for and needing is hope.
All right, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. It's one of the first things you saw was just amazing diversity just in that small sample. And the second thing is some real differences in what they're struggling with. In some cases, it seemed very much like just better housing. Other cases, a real future. What do we mean and how do we think about it? And so what's interesting about all this is that it's really a hard problem to think about what to do. And so I'd actually like to think about three questions. The first question is actually, why don't we just give poor people money? A kind of obvious solution. Why talk about mobility per se? And indeed, we have a classic example here. The second would be, are there some powerful new ideas out there that help us think more effectively about what strategies we might want to pursue? And the third is, are there strategies that really might work? And the reason is this is of particular interest to me, besides the fact that much of my life prior to being a dean, when I took on a very strong interest in billionaires, has been focused on poverty and social policy and the like. I worked in the Clinton administration, as Ngaire mentioned, one of the people in charge of welfare reform during the first part of it, though not happy with the final outcome. And I was asked, not long after I stepped down as dean, by the Gates Foundation, basically, to lead an effort within the United States to ask the question, after much negotiation, to get a group of people, half scholars, half practitioners, to think about really big ideas that would substantially move the needle forward in terms of the chance for people to move up, to have real economic, social, political, whatever you call it, mobility. So mobility from poverty. But it does seem to me that the first question you ought to ask is, well, geez, we define poverty usually by a lack of money. Almost everyone we know that lacks money is got some real challenges associated with it. They may have poor housing. They maybe can't afford to get adequate medical care. They're worried about their future. It seems like such a natural thing to do. And frankly, almost by definition, particularly if you use government definitions, since poverty is often a certain line, all you have to do is give people enough money so that they're above that line, and suddenly there's no more poverty. So that seems like a natural solution. And indeed, if you look and see what countries do, that's kind of where they spend most of their money, giving people support, not all money, but it may be housing, it may be food. To the extent they target this issue, they talk a lot about other things, but they spend their money and their resources. I guess the other two you might think of particularly at such things as education, which of course is more universal, but it obviously is partly a desire to keep people from being in poverty, and then the other is healthcare. I would point out the United States is particularly bad at all three of these, so we do have that to start with. But why not? And by the way, that's one thing government's like really good at. We're really good at writing checks. That's unambiguous. Now, they're not perfect, but compared to most other things, governments are good at writing checks. And here's the question, we actually talked about this question with our group. And again, it's 12 scholars, 12 practitioners, very, very formidable figures in the United States. And mostly what people said was something like this. Poverty isn't a lack of money. It's a lack of power. It's a lack of control. It's a lack of dignity. It's a lack of a sense of being in charge of your future. One of the most conservative members of our group has said that people want is to be valued, be needed, to feel like they matter. That's really what poverty feels like. And indeed, if you ask the overwhelming majority, if you actually did do a careful, systematic look at people in poverty, and certainly look at people on social assistance in the United States, and I suspect it's true in many other countries, they typically don't say what I actually want is money. What I want is a job. What I want is a chance to get ahead. What I want is to be feeling like I'm a full citizen of this country. And so that doesn't come actually from a check. Indeed, it's worse than that. Writing a check oftentimes will make so many strings attached or whatever else that in fact accepting a check feels like you are actually degrading yourself, that you're the other, that you're not a part of the nation. And oftentimes we do things like in the United States. For a long time we had food stamps, so that if you went to use that at the supermarket, everyone could see you weren't using cash, you were using stamps. We put people in public housing, and everybody knows those are public housing units. And we do a whole variety of things like that. And then finally, of course, this is politically very, very costly. It's not only financially very, very costly if you give lots of money. You just think about the Swiss election just in the last few days, where they, on the ballot, there was an opportunity to set a minimum amount of money that every family would get. It was like $30,000 a year, 20,000 pounds. Really quite substantial amount, but the Swiss could afford it. It was only defeated 79 to 21. And the reasons were what are always the reasons: a fear about idleness, a fear of immigrants, a fear of people using it for the wrong things, which is meaning saying those people can't be trusted. And so the real story then, I think the reason that this group is so excited about thinking about it is, can you think actually bolder than just giving money? I'm not saying, please don't hear me to say that the things we do in terms of housing or anything is not unbelievably important. But rather, shouldn't we aspire to something more than that? Shouldn't we aspire to give people the sense of power and control and dignity that they really aspire to? So that's the job. So this group is supposed to come up with big ideas that will move the ball, and it's unbelievably diverse in every conceivable dimension: intellectual diversity, political diversity, scholars, practitioners, different flavors of scholars, different disciplines, different types of approaches that the practitioners, the people who operate programs on the ground. And I can't remember a time when I've been quite so excited and quite so scared. The good news is if we have something good to say, that you might even hear them come out, the words come out of people like Bill and Melinda Gates, which could be a good thing, and lots of people are listening and watching. The bad news is, really? That's how you think about coming up with like really big ideas, is bringing together a really diverse, large group. The good news is I insisted, there's no final report. There's no requirement that we all agree. All we have to do is come up with the best and most interesting ideas. All right, so the next question then for you is, are there some ideas out there? And by that I mean intellectual, scholarly ideas that might give us some hope that this problem, which has been thought about for as long as human beings cared about poor folks, might have some additional answers or insights or whatever. And I'd like to just point out 4 that I would say might give us some help or might give us some place to look to start to look for answers. So our goal here is presumably to give people in poverty a chance to really move out of it. Now, not everyone can do that. Some of the examples you gave would be cases where if someone really is disabled and there's relatively little possibility for them to dramatically take more control of their lives, fine. That's when government should be writing checks and doing more. But on many, many other situations, certainly the Polish example and many others, and in fact the overwhelming majority of poverty in the world, these are cases that are not so simply explained as someone's just sick, or that there's, that they've had a problem. The example of the homeless couple and with alcohol and all those are kind of elements in what you see. All right, number 1. These are in no particular order, by the way. 4 big ideas, though. 4 ideas out there. First will not come as a surprise to any of you. You won't even think it's a big idea. And that is that the industrial age labor market is gone. You know, the old days where you go to work at the factory and you work really hard and you play by the rules and you don't cuss out your boss and you gradually move up and you do well and the union protects you and off you go. That industrial coal miner, that world is pretty much dying. It's pretty much gone. We certainly know that there's been unbelievable amounts of technological change, obviously, and so we got robots that are going to do everything. Pretty soon they're going to drive our cars, which is all fine with me, but it's definitely skill-biased technological change so far. It basically is taking out the duties which maybe people who were lower skilled workers could do. Those robots can put together cars now. But so far, it's therefore advantaged the more highly skilled. We've had a dramatic widening wage inequality, part for that reason. We know about trade and immigration. And trade and immigration, there's just no question that those things on average have improved the quality of life around the world. But in many countries, they've also had the effect of, again, reducing the number of low-skilled jobs that are available for natives to do. Now, of course, in some developing countries, that's where many of those jobs have been moved to. That's a good thing for the world. But it's a challenge. And perhaps even more striking is there seems to be a real loss of the old notion of job ladders, at least within firms. It used to be you stay in a firm. It doesn't matter. It's not just the industrial firm. You'd stay at a firm. You work hard. You climb the ladder, and each step if you worked hard, you could move to the next ladder and so forth. That people stay shorter and shorter times in jobs, and so they kind of have to manage their own careers. And again, for people that are the kind of folks that come to this institution, that's great. That's easy. You're very good at figuring out what the next opportunity is. For a lot of people, it's not at all clear where you go when one job ends and another one. And the Great Recession is just a perfect example of how many of the people that are kind of the working class folks just didn't recover. They maybe got a job, but it doesn't pay nearly as much. There just wasn't a next step or an alternative or the like. So we know those things have changed, and we still, ironically, still see shortages in some places where there's, in the United States, a big shortage of welders and other kinds of things. So there is still a mismatch. Okay, that's one that you know. Second, you know this, but it's now a much bigger deal in thinking, which is place or neighborhood really matters. Regardless of who your parents are, regardless of what their income is and so forth, the neighborhood you grow up in has a big influence, it seems, on your future. at least in the United States. How do we know? Well, a guy by the name of Raj Chetty and a number of his co-authors has managed to get complete access to our tax records going back many years and can match people. And so he literally can say, okay, let me look at the kids that grew up with this family income in this neighborhood and compare them to the kids with the same family income in a very different neighborhood and see how those kids do. How differently do they do? Well, if it's very hard to sort of decide what you mean by this, but let's say, how well do kids do compared to their parents? Okay? So let's say you're a kid in a family in the bottom 20% of incomes. So bottom quintile. The question is, what are your chances of actually getting all the way up to the top 20%? Big leap. Now, if you had a society that was completely mobile, completely open, what would happen? Well, that would mean that anywhere you start, you could end up anywhere. So the people at the bottom, 20%, their odds of getting to the top would be 20%. Okay, people at the top, their odds of staying at the top, 20%. Now, in fact, what you see in the worst neighborhoods, if you go to Atlanta or Chicago or Cleveland or Missouri or St. Louis, your odds, if you are in the bottom 20% of getting to the top 20%, are 5%. If you grew up in San Francisco or Seattle or Boston, your odds are more like 12%. Your income will be 30% higher, adjusting for everything, just by if you are in one of the worst or the best neighborhoods. Now, wait a minute. Can you really judge that? How can you tell, and so forth? Well, the answer is you can compare families that move with families that don't move. And better yet, you can see the younger kids in those families and the older kids in those families. What you discover is that kids in families that move from a bad neighborhood to a good neighborhood do better. And the younger kids who move do a whole lot better than their older siblings who don't have as much time in that new neighborhood. So you really do see neighborhood effects. And there's one other test. There's been experiments done where we sort of give poor folks a chance to move to a better neighborhood, give them a voucher, and they move to opportunity, it's called. And their incomes, interesting enough, the parents do know better. They don't necessarily do terrific in school, but those kids' income is 30% higher than the kids who didn't get a chance to move, just from neighborhood. There's nothing we know of that can guarantee you that people's incomes will be, on average, 30% higher. Two other things quickly. The brains of human beings are very poorly designed for getting people to be mobile out of poverty. Whoever came up with a design for human being brains, it works very well in a lot of settings, but they're really badly designed for this particular task. And why is that? Well, one part you already know, of course, which is that a lot of brain development happens when you're very young. So we managed to put children in families when the families are at their poorest. This is a really bad plan. Poor families are especially poor, so they don't have a lot of resources. Stress is terribly toxic for young children. So they have lots of stress in their lives. So their brains really won't develop as quickly and as fully and so forth. And so no matter what, and those early years are critical. So that's the story you've heard. That's why we want to do early childhood education. Story you've maybe heard, but less more so, is that this business of stress actually explains an awful lot of really bad decision making. Most people, if they took truth serum, would say, I think actually a lot of poor people make really bad decisions. And that's why they're poor. If I was in that situation, I would be much smarter than that. I wouldn't drink. I'd know where to go. I would save myself. And it turns out, here's a hypothetical for you. Consider the idea that you've had a really bad day. We've all been there, but let me describe the day for you. Your boss, Ngaire, actually, came in and she got really angry with you. I mean, you've never seen her get angry. You didn't know it was even possible. No, whatever. Got mad and whatever. And you were just upset and hurt, and you just sat in your office or the classroom, whatever it is, and just stewed on it for a while. And about 20 minutes you said, there's no right to treat me that way. That's outrageous. That wasn't fair, whatever. And you go storming into your boss's office and just cuss him out. This doesn't go well. The boss gets really angry with you and sends you home for the day, or says, get out of my office, get out. And you say, well, screw this, I'm going home. And you look outside and it's raining and you've got a bicycle. You say, screw it, I'm going to take my bicycle, I'm out of here. You get out there and you're fumbling with the key, you almost lose the key. Fortunately, you don't lose the key, but you do get the bike, and then you're getting ready to go, and you say, oh, I promised my wife or my husband that I'd wear a helmet. Helmets are stupid. I'm not going back to get my damn helmet. I'm not going back into there. And off you go. And of course, what happens is it's raining and you're in the bicycle, and you're totally preoccupied with the job. So guess what happens? You're going to have a wreck, okay? And you're going to be in the hospital. How many bad decisions did you make along the way here? Okay, you shouldn't have gone back and talked to your boss when you were really angry. By the way, this is just a life lesson in case you haven't learned it. I have a 24-hour rule on emails that piss me off. It's a really, really, really good rule. And everyone who sends me the emails that piss me off should probably have observed the 24-hour rule also. But I will often type out a response and then say, I'm going to save it, I'll come back in 24 hours. I never send the same email. I'm much more thoughtful and strategic about what I'm trying to accomplish as opposed to why I want to defend. But more importantly, you get preoccupied. Your brain, by its nature, when it's in stress, when it sees something risky, narrows and narrows and narrows the parameters. By the way, you are often, when you're feeling fearful, you can maybe be you maybe are risk. You're fearful of risk. When you're angry, by the way, you welcome risk. That's why people get in fights when they're angry, not when they're feeling meek. So brains are terrible this way. And guess what? Everything I've just described is not even a bad day for a poor person. You don't worry about feeding your kids. You're not actually worried about where you're going to live. You're not really worried about whether your kid's going to die tonight because you can't afford medicine. That's just to say nothing of your own job situation. That's just a totally different level of stress. And so guess what you do? You focus. You focus on getting through the next hour. And we've all been there. But we're not there every day. So that's the third issue. And then finally, I would just say, again, an obvious one, but it's really important, that racism, stigmatism, humiliation, and so forth, the things we just described and the fact that people are isolated that there are people that are stuck in bad neighborhoods or that the police behave in certain ways and so forth, is not by accident. It is partly our brains, but there is a reason why we put public housing far away from the nice people's houses. There is a reason why we build highways between where the poor people live and the rich people live. There is a reason why when we think about why in the criminal justice system we're much more likely to arrest people of color or shoot them if you have guns. You wisely don't, but we do. And part of it is, again, your brain. It turns out, very good studies, if you take two people, doesn't matter what the color is, if you ask a cop, here's a white 15-year-old, here's a black 15-year-old, they've both been accused of this crime, how likely do you think it is they've done it? And more importantly, how old are they? How old are these two individuals? Quick snap judgment. You got to quick, fast. Regardless of color of the cop, the 15-year-old black is considered to be more like 17 or 18, and the 15-year-old white kid is more like 12 or 13. It's just instantaneous reactions. There's no processing going on. It's just there. And by the way, that can help explain why a kid holding a toy gun who's 13 or 14 the person sees 17, 18, 19. That's a threat. That's a big threat. White kid, oh, a kid, calm down. So it over and over again you see this and the like. And so one last example of that. It used to be in many nations, I don't know what it is like in Britain, that grandparents were very strong advocates of more money for schools. Okay, because they were grandkids. I mean, my kids' kids. Now they're not, because the kids in schools don't look like them. They're not my kids, they're those kids. It's us versus them, or us versus other. And, you know, whether it's immigration or crime or whatever else, it's other. You all were very politically correct in describing your poor folks. But most folks, when they think about poor folks, actually don't think about people that look like them. Mostly they don't know very many. But they think about people that are different, that make bad choices, that are people of color and so forth. And that theming of them creates where we are. Now I want to just stop with a couple of hints about where we might go. I've gone on longer than I mean to. It is a typical habit of mine. So the question is, okay, what strategies might work? How might you get there from here? Let me just point out that we already do a ton of stuff. We do pre-child care, we do early childhood education, we do parenting education, we do family planning, we do marriage supports, we have workforce training, we have a whole bunch of other things. And they're all typically small, stovepiped, one-off things. I'm going to get you a job. Come to my 3-week job training program. I'm going to help you learn to be a better parent. Come to my 2-week, make sure you read to your child parenting program. It turns out that mobility is not an event. It is a process. Now, there are some big events. There's the event of having a child or not having a child. That's a big mobility event. But by and large, it's a long process. And it's not a case, again, just think of your bad day. You know, when you're having a bad day and you're thinking about, I want to get a job, but my kid is sick and I don't have a home, that's not, oh, great, I want a job training program. You show up and so on. So that's how we currently do it. And so the question is, part of the reason for this group is to say, maybe we can bring those streams together. And so let me just give you 4 real quick. How do you think about making them into us? How do you change the narrative? It happens. If you think about the set of issues around LGBT, especially LGBT, issues at this stage, there's been a transformative change in the view of marriage and the whole like. This is one very personal for my wife and I. We have 2 daughters. They're both getting married this summer. We're so excited. That's why I'm leaving tomorrow. One of them's getting married in San Francisco. One's gay, one's not. One's rich, one's poor. I mean, it's the same thing. But it's a very, very important set of things. And there are others like, you know, but how do you do that? How do you change the narrative? Well, that's what the group wants to think about. There's obviously things like affirmative action. How do you really, we're actually learning about how you help people not make those snap decisions. The equivalent of my 24-hour rule. You don't have a 24-hour rule when you're on the street and somebody's threatening you. But there are strategies you can use and think about it and so forth. And then the other question is how can you create programs that are less stigmatizing? Shouldn't government actually force itself to think about, gee, this particular program is going to isolate and stigmatize someone. Maybe this isn't the best program, even though it's well-meaning and well-funded. So, make them us. Second, make work work. We actually have learned quite a lot about what are successful training programs and what aren't. We mostly have unsuccessful ones because they're more or less disconnected completely from employers, the market, and so on. I'm an economist. I actually believe in figuring out how to make the market work for you as opposed to not. I won't go into a lot of detail, but there are ways to do that. Second, you can figure out ways to make work pay. We have something known as the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is where you earn $1 and you get 40 cents more from the government for every $1 you earn. Nobody minds it. It's not stigmatizing. Indeed, it turns out that at the end of the year, when you can, poor people that are getting the Earned Income Tax Credit, if they've earned it, it comes at the end of the year. So they go into their tax group firm, it's called H&R Block or whatever, you go in there, and they treat you like you're a hero. They're so happy to see you. Come on in, we want to work with you, and so forth. In fact, we're going to write you a check when you're done here. Now, they're actually writing you a high-interest loan on your refund. The Earned Income Tax Credit gives you money back even if you don't owe taxes. It gets money back to you. People love it. They talk about feeling like they are real citizens just because they were a customer as opposed to a problem. And I think then there's a much harder set of questions about actually figuring out how to generate real job ladders. How do you deal with, one of the pieces of good news is one of the bad news right now. If you think about the services all of us will need as we get older and the things that we can't have robots do, whether it's emptying bedpans or nursing or whatever it is, those jobs are going to be in much higher demand and they're not easily farmed out in any way. And so the question is, how do we create jobs like that that actually are meaningful, that go somewhere and the like, and how can we upgrade them? 3 other things quickly. Invest in place-based solutions. It's kind of obvious. We heard that place matters, neighborhood matters. How do we fix neighborhoods? There are real examples of people that have done that. It's really hard. The reason neighborhood works is they don't do these little different things, right? If you move to a better neighborhood, you get better schools, you get better services, you get better transportation, you get a whole lot of things that are much better. But, bang, it doesn't work. It's really, really hard to do. The alternative is to move people to better neighborhoods, as I said. That is very attractive operationally. It's politically not very attractive for all the reasons. See the previous discussion. But it, again, is part of the strategy. 2 things final. Support comprehensive path-based models. The most interesting and promising programs in the United States right now do not take a single issue and a single moment and try and fix it. They say this is a journey. And many of them have a navigator. I'm going to be with you for the next 5 years. And we want to ultimately get you the job, this job that you've decided you wanted. Say, okay, well, how do we get there? Well, I got to have this training. Okay, how are we going to get there? Well, the problem is I'm homeless and my kid is sick. And so on. And then it says, okay, now, you can't do all those at once. Which thing should we start with? Where do we go? I know the right person to connect you up with. I can connect you with those programs that are out there to help you with this. And you put the pieces together. And by the way, it's all because we think you need to learn how to manage your life, and you can't do it when there's all this stress in it. It's really directly based on the stress-based models. So things like that. And finally, and very fittingly for a school like this, there's tons of data out there. There's tons of stuff happening, and we don't use it well at all in government. I remember I've done tons of site visits as a result of this work, and I remember going to the Department of Public Health in Baltimore, terrible, terribly tough city. And the woman who was the head of that said something very interesting. She was quite young. She's Asian. And she said, and by the way, her staff thinks she's going to be president someday, so maybe that's true. She said, every few months we have a meeting of all the key cabinet officers, as it were, for the city of Baltimore, and we go over the death of every single child in our city and try and understand what happened. Could we have done something more? Was there something we should have done? And in virtually every case, she said, every one of our agencies has a file this thick on that kid or that family. But we never compare them until the kid is dead. And so again, that's another example where we can use more. So that's a long-winded way of saying we are still trying to figure out what to do, but there is hope. And I guess what I would simply say is we don't know how to get to the top of the mountain, but we do know which way is uphill. And so I would say the same thing about creating a school of this sort. You don't know how to get to the top of the mountain, but you do know which ways uphill. So thank you for listening for such a long time. I'm very, very grateful.
Thank you, David. Great. Questions? Evaka. Sorry, we'll just bring you a microphone.
Thank you so much for discussing these ideas with us. With regards to upward mobility, at least in India, I feel that first of all, the problem is, as I understand it, is with people who lie in the economically and socially weak category with regards to the imagination of how to move upwards or what should I want. So when you ask that question, what would be the ideal thing for them? I cannot imagine a lot of answers coming from them. They can list out the problems, but figuring out what is the answer, how can I move upwards, would also be a problem. Second thing that I've realized is that there is a downward force from the society which is which is occupying the positions of superiority in the society. So there is a constant pull and push from people in different stratas of the society. So until and unless people on top would be amenable to that idea, it becomes extremely difficult for people to move upwards or downwards. And how do we communicate that, and how do we bring that in motion?
It's a heck of a hard problem, and it actually sounds very familiar. It's not just India, right? In fact, you heard several things that I said there. One is, part of what, though, the first thing I would just caution you about is the apparent lack of imagination. Remember the story, when you had that bad day, you didn't have any imagination about what it was going, you were just going to do what you were going to do or whatever. You were just getting by. And so people will surprise you when they suddenly have those options. That doesn't mean that necessarily not when things are in a different situation, they can do better. And so that's why I think this pathway models, which I went through quickly, but with a navigator, someone who says, what do you really aspire to? Let's talk it through. It doesn't tell you. It's not that. I'm your advocate. I'm there to help. We can talk it through. But what I do bring to the table is some knowledge about some strategies to help you think how to prioritize a few things and where to get help on those things that are really a problem. So that's at least a starting point. But I also, it wasn't by accident that I talked about this set of issues about race or class or, structural things. There is, I was talking to one of your colleagues here. What's the woman, the Israeli woman who does education? Yuli. Yuli just made this, she ran education for the State of Israel for a while, and she sort of said, the one thing I discovered is this, that no matter how much you put into schools, parents will fight to the death to make sure their kid has the most advantage. So if you put in a lot more money for poor schools, the richer parents are going to put even more money into their kids. Okay, so there is a real issue there, but I actually don't agree that you can't do more. I think in most societies, I will just speak for the United States, but and hope that it applies more broadly. The notion that you want a society that gives people a genuine chance to move forward is very, very attractive and very, very compelling. It's not that I want to give you a handout. That's why the checks are so concealed. But the idea that a hand up, not a handout. But in terms of the very specifics, I think you got to get after that. And I think you have to think about it. And there are different strategies. And that's the hardest part we have to do. How do you make them us? How do you make it? How do you come to admire how far someone goes in such difficult circumstances, as opposed to what's wrong with those people? How can they live like that?
Thank you, Professor. A very compelling and fulsome presentation. I really appreciate your time. My name is Zara. I'm one of the MPP students. I'm from Britain. My question is, when I contemplate some of the solutions you set out, particularly the idea of an advocate or a navigator, this seems brilliant. And I wonder why it hasn't happened. And I think about two things: lack of political will and cost-benefit analysis. And this has become a sort of neutral way of assessing policies, as opposed to the ideological way it is. So I wonder, what are your thoughts on overcoming that?
Good points, and I think part of it is, no question, is really political will. I didn't go through all the negatives, which I'm really very good at, but one of the things, it's from time immemorial, people have noticed that people are on multiple programs, and they say, why don't they just have one caseworker that does it all? If you actually ask people who are in poverty, they say, I don't like that idea. And you say, why? I said, well, if it could be Julie, if she was my caseworker, then I'd be for it, but not Jim or Sandra or whatever. All these other people, they're horrible people. They want to run my life. They tell me what to do, and they don't know me at all. That kind of thing. So there's one issue. It's not just that it's political will. It's actually, you have to find really good people and really spend money and resources for it. So it's even more expensive than you think. On the cost-benefit side, I agree it's a problem, but you have to decide. Ironically, it's good news that most of our developing countries have huge issues around demographic aging. And so our workers, all of our workers, by and large, are not children who look like our kids, okay? They're a different generation. They're immigrants, they're people of color, there are people that come from disadvantage. And if we do nothing, we're actually going to fail or not do nearly as well collectively. And so there is a reason to do it, and that's part of the story, and it's part of the reason that I think there is energy. Secondly, you watch the politics. A lot of the politics around Trump, around Brexit, and so forth, is this magnified. It isn't just the bottom, of course, but it is a recognition that the middle things just aren't working right. And then the last point I would simply say in that vein is it does take work and it does take effort in terms of viability. But there is a good example in the United States of a program that is just like this one I described, Navigator, deeply intense. Their goal is to find you, someone who's been involved in the criminal justice system, and maybe they've just come out, maybe they've been arrested, whatever, and even when they don't want help, they start harassing them. They follow them every day. They're with them and eventually get them whatever. And it seems like it's working so well, really well, and they are being evaluated purely. They're going to be paid on a purely, pay for performance kind of strategy. In their case, they're keeping people out of prison. Prisons are incredibly expensive. And so it's way cheaper. If their program works, they're actually a bargain. And you can prove that. So that's not going to be true in a lot of cases, but sometimes it is.
Boo.
Thanks, David. I think the two most important sentences for this problem is one formulated by the legendary philosopher John Rawls. He says, a just system must generate its own support. So when you construct welfare system, they must be so constructed that they generate their own support.
Yep.
The second is by an American scholar, I'm sure you know, Hugh Heclo. The best way to help the poor is not to talk about them. By this it means you should have universal program where poor people are included as everyone else. So I don't think it's correct when you say a check is not good. A check is very good if it goes to everyone, like universal childcare. Let me illustrate this with a true story. Some 10 years ago, I was at a private dinner, and I met a leading female politician from the Conservative Party. And at that time, the Social Democrats ruled. And the Social Democrats had built a quite high-quality preschool system that was universal. But they had steep costs. So for people who did lots of money, it costed a lot of people. What they did was to get rid of all this. So they introduced a universal, very low, and it still is, very low fee for reasonably high quality childcare. And the Conservative politician really didn't like this. But she said, we're stuck. We cannot do anything. All my female friends call me and say, if you now come to power, and they did, don't touch it, because that is how they had made their career and was making their career. So the program was constructed in such a way that the middle and even the upper middle class was included. When I tried to explain this for my American colleagues, I say, the Scandinavian system here is universal Head Start. And they don't understand it, because Head Start in the United States, it's basically for poor black kids, right? But that is, of course, the way to go. If you want to, you have to create the programs in such a way that they generate their own support. And if the middle class is not in, it will be poor program and they will be stigmatizing.
So I couldn't agree more with everything you've said. And certainly universal programs are terrific. And again, once they're in place, once you're there, it's very, very hard to get rid of them, with some caveats, all right? Scandinavia, when all this happened, looked a whole lot like where I grew up in Minnesota, okay? Minnesota looked a whole lot, every Minnesotan looked pretty much like every other Minnesotan, and there was a real sense that those were our children, And so the political will and so forth was certainly there. The second thing is the expense is enormous. And in the United States context, I mean, the example of Switzerland, that was going to be a universal guarantee. Now, it wasn't a service, okay? It wasn't, but if you instead said, let's spend $30,000 each on something. So the real question is how in places like Switzerland or the United States or whatever else that they're not in that place, do you come up with the will to really radically increase taxes in order to provide benefits universally?
Programs are for free. I mean, a middle-class family have to pay for childcare, either privately or out of their taxes. And everything I know about asymmetric information would say it's much better if you pool it collectively.
So the programs are not for free, obviously, since we're providing new programs to people that don't currently have them. And so we are, in fact, raising the cost. Now, we're not targeting them quite as tightly and all that sort of thing. Again, I really fundamentally agree with you, but it is not a trivial problem to solve either politically, but also just operationally. Because if you decide you're going to actually produce the same thing for everybody, rich people will want to opt out, and on it goes. It's just, and part of that's just the American tradition.
Right. I'll take a couple of questions. Yeah, sure.
Hi, thanks, David, for the lecture. I'm João from Brazil. I want to jump in this point that you made, how to make the us, including the point that if they are not visible. I lived for 2 years in a slum in Brasilia, trying to see, and it's like it was the biggest garbage dumping for Latin America, and it was like 15 minutes from the center of the power in Brasilia. And those people were completely invisible for the public. So I completely agree. I think the main lesson of this experience was how these people were completely invisible. They just wanted to be recognized much more than an idea of cash transfer. I think they want to see recognized as people more than as citizens, because people, they are not seen. So I think the most challenging point is how to make this poverty visible, because I realize this. If we are in a place with 15 minutes from the center of power, these people are not even seen. So if they are not seen, they are not in the agenda. So how to make them us if they are not visible? How do you think is the main strategy or answer to make them visible? Because I think that is the main challenge in this situation.
What's your answer to that?
I think the most important for policymakers, so in that experience, we try to build bridge for policymakers, because I work in the government. So I think it's to try to put people in contact, because we see that people from the middle class or that were all working in the government, they never saw these people because they were never there. So just if you go there and you build a relationship between people, humans, that make them visible. So it started as people in a personal approach. So see that they have families, they have children, and sometimes they have the same challenge and the same fears. And when we start in this personal approach, they start seeing them, and we can talk about public policy. So I think is starting in a personal relationship and moving for what is the problem and how can we attack that problem.
I think that's brilliant. I completely agree. One of the things that we've required of everybody, when I was one of the people in charge of welfare reform during the hopefully first Clinton administration, we required every single person, a big committee, big group trying to put together the policy and so forth. We required every single person to to go to what we called a welfare office, to sit through a visit, to do a focus group with welfare recipients, and hopefully to visit somebody's house, okay? And the shocking thing was, many of these people had spent their lives in government or in, in the Congress, whatever, working on these issues, and they had never once done any of those things. And the most common reaction people say is, I just didn't know. You just didn't know. You sort of say, you've been on, did you like never have a free afternoon? But people just don't see. So I think, and by the way, for this group, same thing. By the way, we had our first meeting. We opened with 3 quick snippets of people talking about their lives. And every meeting of this group will include a site visit. It's not that we picked a site that's perfect. It's the site that's real. And so it's a fundamental part of it. So I think that's part of it. But I also think it takes much more. There are occasionally events which just simply change the narrative. Great television can do that. Social media can do that. Things happen. And I think it's incumbent on all of us, and particularly all of you, to figure out those ways to make something happen. And often it is really somehow I suddenly thought, actually, that could be me. That is my child. That is unfair. I am actually not quite so sure about what's wrong with them as much as what's wrong with me, that kind of question. That's a hard problem.
David, could I pick
Yes.
up two of your kind of points? Your very first point was that cash, why don't we give more cash? And I just want to pause on that for a second, because it strikes me that from the other things you've said tonight, there are 2 sort of types of problem that we're lumping under the label poverty. And one is a structure where people are just earning less and less able to make ends meet. For people that watch British television, you saw the owner of Sports Direct being grilled by a select committee. He apparently didn't realise that while he was earning hundreds of millions of pounds each year, his workers were being paid less than the minimum wage and not allowed toilet breaks and fined for being 15 minutes late, etc. And these are people, some of whom are on 0-hour contract. Their lives are actually simply having more money, as your working tax credit showed, does make a difference. And it seems to me that the evidence from around the world where you just give money, even without conditions, shows that the poor make good choices. Okay, unless they're in really a desperate situation. The Victorian idea that they will always be improvident and reckless and spend all their money on alcohol is not one that's borne out by the evidence of cash programs. So question 1 is, are you writing off just giving more money too quickly? And question 2 is, as you know, here in the school, we're setting up this government outcomes laboratory to look at how you constructively at social impact bonds, at outcomes-based commissioning. You touched on getting people out of the prison system. And I guess my concern with that is that the problem that I see at the coalface is the other one that you touched on, that nobody takes responsibility for the child who's at risk. This person says, my responsibility is just their health. This person says, my responsibility is just to get them into school. The police officer says, my responsibility is just to make sure that nobody's breaking the law. And nobody is taking responsibility for the child. So is there a risk, as we develop social impact bonds and outcomes-based commissioning, that we continue to divide up the one human being into 3 outcomes? And we have this bond that is to keep them out of prison. We have this bond that is to keep them from being obese. We have this bond, and we're missing the point, which is, for that category, it's perhaps either a deficit of aspiration or a deficit of, or just incredible life challenges, cycles of abuse, cycles of addiction, which they really need help through. So I just wanted, cash, getting people to take responsibility.
So look, so great questions, and in both cases, I have substantial sympathy for what you have to say. I mean, the first point is, it's true, his workers would be a little better off if they were paid more. Mm-hmm. But really what they want is a little more control over their lives. They'd actually like to get jobs that pay better. Yes, jobs should pay better, and I'm all for doing things to make that happen and so forth. But I'm afraid that that's not going to change the people who are in oppressive job situations. There'll be something else. You know, you change the rules about bathroom breaks, okay. You already said they have a minimum wage and it's not even being paid. So I think that particular example is actually not what I'm talking about, but it is certainly an appropriate example. I do think that there are ways in which you can provide income. But you notice the earned income tax credit, the reason that's so different than the welfare check to them is they earned it. They believe that's an earned benefit. And they go in and people proudly give it to them, and by and large people are, that's great, congratulations, you earned it. And so it's not conditional tax transfers, which are almost always the opposite of that. We're going to pay, you unless you behave, we're going to take away money. That's the opposite feel, even though it's operationally perhaps similar. But the much larger set of issues is, I of course agree that there are many situations when just money's the issue, okay? You just need to write a check. And believe me, I have visited many homes, and there are many situations where you say, please just write them a check and be done with it. Actually, if you, just to give you one real quick example, I remember a woman in one of the focus groups years ago said, look, I've been on and off welfare for about 15 years. I've been in and out of the welfare office dozens of times. She said, every time they said, here, fill this out to get your food stamps, here, this is what you need for your Medicaid card, here's what you got to do for your this and that. And she said, but that really wasn't what I needed, and it certainly wasn't what I wanted. I expected every time I go in, I expected someone to say, what's your problem, how can I help? Which is to your second question. And she said, now I'm in a training program to be a welfare worker, and I just discovered they weren't supposed to ask me that, as though that was a proud revelation. But again, that's the problem. And to me, at some level, the question isn't whether money matters. Of course money matters. Of course it's fundamental. The question is, shouldn't we aspire to more than that? And the nice thing about doing that is it's actually politically more palatable to say that we want to give people a genuine chance to be on their own 2 feet and compete. The hand up instead of a handout. Which brings me to your second point. Boy, do I agree on several different elements of what you just said about the isn't it worrisome that we'll be so focused on A, B, and C we lose sight of the person. And I think that's precisely why the models that I sort of described actually weren't, I believe very much in a certain amount of pay for performance, but that doesn't mean it has to pay off. It may, but the model, remember the last model that's the closest to this was the navigator model. That's the person who you might want to measure, and you want to say, how are those people doing that are in your care? And you're responsible for the whole, panoply of things. There are even attempts in some communities across the United States, I don't think it quite makes sense, but where the whole community comes together and all the nonprofits and NGOs and so forth say, okay, we are collectively responsible for we want from a cradle to career of all the children in our community. And we're going to figure out the handoffs, the ways in which we connect, how to do that. We're going to solve that Baltimore problem. That's the theory. Now, human beings being human beings, complexity being what it is, everybody that's ever run an institution has had someone tell them, stick to your knitting, take 2 things and do it well. And you can't be great at providing childcare and supporting mothers and nurture and all the other things at the same time. But there are people that can help you navigate those kinds of things. So I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong. I actually think it's inherently wrong not to do that, because we've spent millions and billions of dollars on job training programs that were worthless and on many other things. I think that's just as appalling. And it's part of the reason social programs have a bad name. But I don't think it has to be immediate cost benefit. My prison example is a good one. But even that, what they provide is not a single service. They say, they have a work program that they want people to be in. They talk to them. It's very much about cognitive behavioral therapy. And okay, why didn't you show up? What happened? They expect failure, and they literally. You talk to these young, these petite interesting males and females, whatever they are, going and they go knock on these ex-cons' doors at 6 a.m. in the morning and say, "Get the heck out of bed." I mean, I was talking to one person who'd been in there and said, you know, this is a woman who was in the program. She said, she was knocking on my door. I could see her down there, and I pretended not to be here. I got my phone number changed so that she wouldn't bother me anymore. But ultimately they stuck with me, and it worked. And my point isn't whether that's a good system or that's an oppressive system. My point is, any measurement system is flawed to the extent you measure the wrong stuff. But I also believe that smart, thoughtful people can iterate towards something that does measure the right stuff. So, you know, it's kind of obvious, but again, that's at its heart. And, you know, ultimately, this is a set of issues that is really, really hard.
Yeah.
Is really, really scary, and really does require people of different backgrounds, a group not unlike the one that I'm chairing. And you can see why it scares me, and you can see why I'm excited. Because if a bunch of people start saying this is one of the 2 or 3 most fundamental issues that we as a nation in the United States or people have to pay attention to more broadly, there's much more of a chance that we'll do some good out of it. So.
Fantastic. I'm going to take the last couple of questions. Can we perhaps take the two questions back here, Alex and Ye-Jian, and then a couple down here? Would you like to take a couple
Sure, that'd be great.
and then we'll...
Professor Elwood, that was really interesting. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about specific strategies to combat elderly poverty. You mentioned briefly about demographic change, and I'm originally from Korea, and in Korean society, poverty among senior citizens has been a huge issue, but it seems like the politics around welfare reform, creating comprehensive welfare programs to support elderly citizens, it's been so contentious. So how do you mobilize sort of, you know, popular opinion or public will to push through those changes that are needed, especially when it comes to combating senior citizens' poverty?
And Alex?
Thanks, David. It's more just a comment or so, if that's all right. And it's around optionality. And I think when we spoke earlier about people's idea of poverty, a lot that came up was around power and control. And for me, it's about choice. I think a lot of poor people, the thing that confronts them most is their inability to choose the right way forward for their kids or for themselves. And so I think when we talk about the kind of solutions to poverty, it's really important that we don't try and create this kind of take this social planner type approach to it, and instead allow people that are living in poverty, as much as they are able, to choose what the right intervention is for them. And as you said, to walk in and say, these are my problems, how can you help? I think that's critical, because for some people an injection of cash might be appropriate and what they need in order to bump themselves up above the poverty line and live a better life. For other people it might be a more kind of comprehensive approach to a whole range of issues. And there's a program in Australia that you might be interested to look at, the Aboriginal Employment Covenant, which was about trying to get Aboriginal people into jobs that, obviously it is just still focused on jobs rather than the full package, whatever that might be. But it was providing a mentor to each Indigenous person to be talking them through the day-to-day activities of getting up, getting out of bed, getting into the job, maintaining the job, keeping everything, you know, on lockdown at home so that they could continue to show up to work. I think the challenge with that has been taking it to scale, because it's hard to provide that kind of comprehensive intervention. And also it's difficult because if people don't have that buffer of cash, there's a whole lot of externalities that might derail their involvement in a program like that, which is often pretty time consuming. So just a couple of comments there. And then the very last one, Ngaire, was just about the slum communities, actually, because I think one of the things that we also need to be more effective at is helping to mobilize people that do live in poverty to articulate what they need, because often I feel that we don't always get a lot back from them, but we're trying to come up with it all up here. And in my experience, actually, it's been that when asked what they need and what they want, I mean, that's counterintuitive to my previous comment about choosing options, but obviously there's different dimensions of poverty as well.
Thank you. Shall we
Sure.
just Just two brief questions here.
Thank you. I'm Dinesh. I'm one of the MPP students here. That was lucid and thoughtful. I want to take one step away from the comprehensive path-based response and just ask you a question about what is an appropriate response for the individual when they're faced with striking poverty, and there are examples not just on the street but maybe on your computer screen as well. The individual that is not poor, the individual that is probably in this room, what is an appropriate response for them?
You walk past homeless people, right?
Hi, thank you, Professor, for that talk, for that very nuanced talk. I'm Sushant. I'm also an MPP student here. So can you just talk a little bit about the information availability and the asymmetry information? Because a lot of the things that we have spoken about today about for a poor person to be able to imagine, to be able to decide, I think information is one critical element which can seem to be a deterrent for a poor person to be able to choose. So, and like second part of the question is does it differ significantly between a poor in a rich country and a poor in a poor country? Does that information, like overcoming the information asymmetry, does it differ significantly between the two type of countries?
Right, and very last question right here.
Thank you. I'm Robbie Tilliard. I'm an economic historian. I wonder if we're being politically correct when we are saying migration isn't the core answer to this. We know from Chetty's work that cities are important and which cities work. Should we actually be much more strident and say we need to move or at least assist and provide incentives for people to move to places that it's working? And the example in the UK is for decades they've tried to keep the north going, but actually by doing so they've lost about 20% of jobs that could have been created in the south by doing so.
Those are all great questions, and I just agree with them, so it's fine. We can quit. Let me go quickly. The first thing I should just say is I learned long ago that I don't know very much about poverty in the United States. I know vastly less about poverty in other countries. I spent some time understanding British things years back, and I've been to Australia now and then, but that's it. So, don't, and I try not to say too much about it. And in this case, in the example of the elderly, I find it actually a puzzle from the outside, because this actually doesn't fall exactly into the same pattern that in many of the ones, the us versus them. Elderly folks, by and large, have children, okay? And it's easy to imagine that your own, even if it's not your own parents, I suspect some of it maybe have to do with the tradition and the changing traditions of responsibilities of children for their parents. And in some cases, the children do take that responsibility. In some cases, they don't. So it's actually a flipping. But I don't fully understand it. And it seems to me that the sort of the shining a spotlight and humanizing it, if that's not being done with a great deal of, I would just think it's, the group of people where you don't say, gee, they're just making bad choices, gee, the older folks built this world. I mean, they built our world, and they deserve at some point to be, and they're often not in any realistic position to work. And I think one of the great tragedies of life is there's a group where you basically, again, say, yes, there are many things you might do to make it easier for them to get around and so on, to empower them as well. But checks are an awfully obvious place to start there. You're not worried that, oh, they're going to give up their third job when they're 88 years old. I mean, so I wish I had an answer for you, but I do think I've heard that before, and I just don't fully understand it, and I'd at some point love to hear more about that kind of question. But I do think so much of this is figuring out a way to make people see, because I actually think people just don't know, and they work very hard not to see because their own problems are hard enough. Thank you very much. Next point was the choice, which, as you pointed out, you're in favor of choice, unless you think you'd like to help them make their choices or not. But yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I don't mean to suggest, one of the worries in terms of even as I talked about this, realizing it, this is not a talk I've given before in this forum, it can sound like very condescending, as sort of people don't make good choices, and you just need, if you just had a good navigator to help you make a good choice and so forth. And that's relative to your information point as well. I mean, a huge part of the problem is people have no conception, don't have the information, they don't see it, or whatever else. And so creating choices really matters. Having said that, if you, for example, it turns out that lots of people aren't very good consumers. When you look at choice in schools in the United States, the very best schools in the United States and the very worst schools are choice schools. Okay, because it's very hard to judge for an ordinary person and so forth. And, you know, you're selling something. And so that doesn't mean you couldn't create better. I mean, my solution to that is not to shut down all those choice schools, figure out better ways to help it measure. But I really do agree with that. And I think it's that a huge part of the problem is people are just constrained in ways that are just horrible. But I also think they're constrained in no small measure that they don't actually have the time and the energy to actually look and see and understand. They're too busy trying to get by. And again, if you're wondering how you're going to feed your baby tomorrow, really having a lot of good information is not that helpful. And being told that, gee, if you only got a job in 3 months' time, you could feed your baby is really not good advice. And no parent, or very few parents, are going to take it. And if they do that, in the certainly in the advanced world, they would probably have their children taken away from them. Because we had a recent example of that, where someone literally was about to lose their job, left their kids, young kids, in their house. They were asleep, went to the job, there was a fire, and a kid died, and the mother was brought up on charges. Okay. Now, that's a really hard problem. Who's to blame? But it's really, really not a good situation. And so I really agree with you. And that comes to your choice question, which is, I think what is striking is that all human beings have a kind of conception, a narrative of the world that helps them understand their world. And the problem is it's usually pretty inaccurate, even for their own world. And as you start getting beyond it, it's really quite inaccurate. That's not actually the way the world works. And by the way, you see this politically as well. Just constantly, politicians can prey on people thinking that the world works one way when it doesn't. So I think one of the great wonders of the world is the cell phone, and the way that people are getting connected, and they're learning about options and jobs and what's happening. And by the way, that's holding governments accountable in ways that never happened before, and so on. I think one of the great challenges of the world is the cell phone, because it spreads rumors, it creates falsities. In theory, the Arab Revolution happened because a guy burned himself to death because he was angry at the way a bureaucrat had treated him. And what we don't know is whether he had a case or not. So I think that finding ways to tame that is one of the great opportunities and great challenges for your generation, honestly. Joe and I talked about this yesterday at a different seminar, and he said, I am not a digital native, I never will be. He said, I'm much more of an immigrant, and I speak with a really thick accent in talking about cyber stuff. And I thought there was a day when I was a digital fit, but it's long ago, and I can't even speak the language half the time. And so I'm still of that generation, that thinks that Facebook is some bizarre cult of self-revelation that will hurt you when you grow up. So it's bizarre. Having said all that, information is critical. And one other thing, what was your question?
Should you walk past?
Oh, should you walk past?
Person in poverty.
Look, one of the striking events for me in my life was there was a moment when I was somebody talking about changing the narrative. When I was much younger, a guy who produces television programs, documentaries, came to me and said, I wanted you to work with me and kind of be the talking part of the 20-part series on poverty in America. I worked long and hard on it and never went anywhere. But the thing that really struck me is when I would visit his building, every day as we went into the building, there was a guy sitting there clearly an alcoholic, or clearly that's unfair of mine, but whatever, was there every day. And he put $20 in his cup whenever he was there, every time. Wow, I mean, I would never do that. But I was really touched by that. And so that's a small thing. But I also believe those small things don't add up. And so I think the real question is, how do you think about leveraging your capacities and your energies, either by giving money to groups that are doing it, or voting for the right people, or leading whatever political elements you have. But I do think maybe this is just stupid, but even just saying, looking someone in the eye when they ask you for something, saying, no, I'm sorry. They at least existed. They weren't invisible. And you had to decide no. That's okay. I mean, there's 100 good reasons to say no, but at least you looked them in the eye. Maybe that's nothing.
Thank you very much, David. I'd like to call on Tanisha on behalf of the Master of Public Policy students to thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Professor Elwood, thank you so very much for what was a very, very, very good discussion. You shared your insights, and I think it provoked a very engaging conversation. I think what I was particularly struck with was the link or the frame that you made throughout between poverty and what that means for equal citizenship. I think going forward, we'll not only reflect on the insights shared here today, but we'll see how best those insights might influence the decisions that we make in our own local circumstances. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, I just want to say one thing. I've already actually stolen one of these. So I'm not going to take this one because I've stolen the other one, because I thought, I really want to have one of these. And I should ask, and they'd say yes, and it would be okay. So this makes me feel much better.
And I'd like you to invite you all to join us for drinks, right? I'm just checking here. For a little reception, our way of yet again thanking David and Marilyn for spending this term here. I think they're up in the window to the world on the first floor. So for those of you that can join us, please join us. And for everybody else, as well as you, please join me in thanking Professor Elwood.
Thank you.